So with that, let's begin. Our first speaker today is Dr. Shana Sundstrom. Dr. Sundstrom is a resilience ecologist based at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center for Resilience and Agricultural Working Landscapes, and also for the Network of Integrated Agricultural Resilience Research. Welcome.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Was that a yes? Liz, are you? Oh, everybody's muted. Okay, I'm going to assume we are all good. I apologize for my voice. I have quite a bad cold right now. I don't normally sound like Kermit. Um, I am Shana Sundstrom. I am a complex systems ecologist and a resilience scholar, which is basically a fancy way of saying I'm not a soil scientist. I'm not even excuse me, technically an agricultural researcher, although the last 4 years I've been working in ag systems. But I do know resilience science, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I hope that by the end of this, there's some pieces of it that are interesting for everybody here. I'm going to talk about theory a fair bit, and what the heck these words mean, because just in the last 3.5 years, there have been more than 60,000 papers with the word resilience in the title. And so that explosion of this term in this field of science across, well, everywhere, has been accompanied by quite a lot of confusion about what the heck it means. And there's some very good reasons for some of that confusion, and I'll talk about a couple of them today. So when I talk about resilience science, I'm talking about a paper that Buzz Howling wrote in 1973. And he's an ecologist, and he had this wide group and expanding over time group of collaborators that eventually became the Resilience Alliance. And most resilience theory has been developed by this broad group of collaborators. And when I say broad, from the beginning, Buzz was collaborating as a forest ecologist working with pests. He was collaborating with physicists and economists and agricultural scientists, like across many different fields. And most importantly, he was exquisitely aware of the development of complexity science, which also really got its legs underneath itself in the early 1970s. And what that means is that the theory of resilience science, of what ecological resilience means, was from the beginning explicitly embedded in an understanding of all of these systems that we're interested in as being complex adaptive systems. And I would argue that basically any biological system is a complex adaptive system, including agricultural systems. So what does that mean? Because that has really profound ramifications for how you go about like interrogating your system of interest. What are the assumptions that you make about dynamics and behavior when you're assuming that your system is a complex adaptive system? And so some of them are that your system is at non-equilibrium, that your system has inherent irreducible uncertainty, that your system, often under the same parameter space, can be in multiple alternative states or regimes or attractors. Those are almost complete synonyms. That your system has nonlinear dynamics, that your system is non-stationary, that there's hierarchical structure at multiple scales and with cross-scale feedbacks, that your system, even if it's just a teaspoon of soil, evolved through processes of self-organization. There's no top-down dictator telling soil microbes how to behave. And these last two, path dependence and that history matters, I would say that soil scientists actually understand that very well because of the importance of soil legacy, right? That how your soil behaves today is completely a function of everything that's happened in that land before now. If you wanted to take it all the way back to the formation of the planet and, bedrock. Now, if you're coming at your system, your field, your plot, your farm, whatever it is, with reductionist assumptions, it's a really different set of assumptions about what kind of behavior you expect. And to be fair, this is how most of us were trained, maybe even all of us. And even if we've been exposed to ideas of complex systems, when it comes to actually doing research, for those of us here who are research scientists, it's generally a lot easier to kind of devolve to these reductionist assumptions because it makes things a lot more tractable. And it's not that these are per se wrong, it's that they don't hold over particularly large spatial and temporal scales, and they for sure don't encompass the full suite of dynamics and behavior that's possible. So those assumptions are that your system is at a single global equilibrium, is on a fixed point attractor, that it's predictable, and that if it's not predictable, you just need to gather more information and you can make it predictable. That it's got linear dynamics. But those first two especially, they exclude the possibility of there being alternative regimes, which in turn excludes the possibility of choosing to deliberately transform your system to a more desired regime. And finally, that the system is stationary. Now, probably the biggest source of confusion about what resilience means is because Holling published this paper in 1973 and launched this whole field of science, but Stuart Pym, another ecologist, started promoting an idea in like 1976 that's been termed engineering resilience. And I mean, God knows why everybody had to use the same word. But Pym's idea that he promoted, it wasn't technically his idea, but he's best known for promoting this idea of engineering resilience emerges from literally engineering and a tradition in materials science, a really important tradition to understand the behavior and property of materials. Because if you're going to build a bridge, you need to know exactly how much wind shear that bridge can handle, right? Because there's literally lives on the line. And so engineers want to understand things like resistance. Will a material bend? If it bends, will it bounce back? And what are the limits to that stability domain? How far can you bend it before it breaks? And this is an incredibly reasonable approach to engineering materials, which are not organic and does not make sense entirely when you apply it to ecological or agroecological systems. But that is what Pym did. And so engineering resilience, and you'll note all these repetitive terms that go back to that reductionist list, is focused on return time to an equilibrium state after a disturbance. So this assumes a single global equilibrium, system stationarity, and it's emphasizing stability, return time, and recovery to equilibrium. There are a lot of synonyms for this kind of broadly across the literature and different agencies as they've used this term, resilience. And those include bounce back, recovery, and resiliency. So when you see those words, you can almost be certain that what's being talked about is this idea of engineering resilience. And we know, I mean, anybody who's worked in an organic system, like logically, we know the Humpty Dumpty effect holds, right? Like Humpty's on his wall, he gets pushed off, he gets broken into a whole bunch of pieces. You can glue him back together again, but he's not the same, right? It's like the saying about the never being able to step foot in the same river twice. And so when we think about our agronomic systems, they can maybe return to a more or less similar-ish place, but this idea of them being exactly the same after every disturbance, we know it's not true. So in contrast to that, we have Holling's ecological resilience, which is defined here a couple ways. First, as a measure of the amount of disturbance that's needed to drive or push an ecosystem from one, let's call it a dynamic equilibrium or regime, preferred term, to a different regime. And so if the cup is the state space and the ball is the system, it's about how much disturbance a system can absorb and buffer before it gets pushed into a new cup. And we define a regime as the characteristic set of processes, structures, and functions. And the most important thing I want you to note here is that this is not good or bad. Every USDA document I've ever read that talks about resilience is like, we want more resilience. We need to build more resilience. But we probably all know ag systems that are highly maladaptive, right? They're not sustainable. They're very resilient. They're very difficult to change. The wheat-rye rotation in the Palouse is often put forward as an example of that. So we need to decouple the desirability of a system state from how resilient it is. So what is a classic examples of regime shifts, moving from one regime to another? Your oligotrophic lake and your eutrophic lake, often under the same phosphorus parameter. Coral dominated reef system or reef system dominated by macroalgae. And to be clear, that macroalgae dominated system is extremely resilient. It's really hard to move it back to a coral dominated state, which means it's a lot better to avoid these undesired regime shifts before they happen. Now, when we think about these ecological terms and we want to apply them to agricultural systems, we have to be quite careful and thoughtful about how we do that because they're not the same. Um, Agricultural systems are obviously ecological in origin because they're predicated on a biophysical land base, but they exist for people and by people. And we need to accommodate that when we translate any of these concepts to agriculture. And so we've been thinking about this in LTAR a fair bit, and we've defined agroecological resilience as the ability to maintain desired agricultural system functions, that's that human agency part, and the structures and processes that support them, so that's, capturing the regime, in the face of complex and accumulating shocks and stresses. And we've parsed it into these 4 capacities, but to be clear, you can skin this cat a few different ways. And so these are the capacities that we've focused on as kind of comprehensively capturing some of the most important dynamics. Now, these first 3 of resistance, recovery, and adaptability, they're about supporting the ability of your system to change in order to stay in the same space. And this works great unless thresholds get crossed and you have an undesired regime shift that happens. And then that's where this 4th capacity of transformability comes in, because it's about whether or not you have the capital, the crop insurance, the knowledge, the resources, the network to deliberately transform your system to a new regime. And we know all too well that a lot of times producers do not have that capacity. So very briefly, resistance is just about simply not being disturbed by a disturbance, right? It just doesn't impact you. Recovery is bounce back. So this is one aspect of resilience. Literally, you're disturbed, how fast can you recover? Adaptability is like how much you can tweak and change things in order to respond to shocks and stresses. And there's often limits on adaptive capacity as well that come from like more policy and financial economic reasons. And finally, transformability, which I think I explained well enough. So a couple quick examples. These examples reflect a specific form of resilience, all right? So this is the resilience of plants, specifically to climate change amplified straight line wind events specifically. And that's different than a system level resilience. So resistance could mean your plants just don't bend. Recovery, they bend, but they literally bounce back. Adaptability, maybe you genetically modify your crop so it doesn't bend. Transformability, maybe you're planting with something that's more appropriate to these events because they're happening with much greater frequency. Second example, resilience of crops to flooding. Again, a specific example. So resistance could mean building a levee so you just don't even get disturbed by the flood. Recovery could mean you have plants that are oxygen starvation tolerant. Flood tolerant adaptability, maybe you're planting buffer strips in order to absorb that disturbance, reduce its impacts. And transformability, maybe if you have the capacity, you're taking crops out of the floodplain entirely and you're transforming to permaculture or something that's appropriate for being flooded. Now, it's worth saying that large scale regime shifts, they don't happen very often, not in ecosystems or agricultural systems, but when they do, they tend to be extremely consequential. The US Dust Bowl is, of course, the most iconic event in our history. And it's very much a Humpty Dumpty effect. It took decades and buckets of money, and those lands have been more or less restored. They are not what they used to be. So way better to avoid that regime shift in the first place. And we have more vulnerable landscapes in North America than I think many people understand at large spatial and temporal scales, from California citrus to desertification of rangelands, cedar invasion, etc. And you'll note that of these examples, There's only one that's the direct consequence of climate change. There's no question that climate change is amplifying all of these, the vulnerability of these systems, but they were in trouble before climate change. And, I've been using this Florida example for the last couple of years, and it gets more sad every year, but we have a contemporary example of large scale collapse. Florida citrus started in the late 1800s with about 5 million boxes of citrus production annually, peaked in the 90s at about 300 million boxes of citrus production, and has since precipitously collapsed. I think the expectation is 12 million of boxes of production this year. This is an extremely undesired regime shift. They have not been able to transform. These producers have not been able to find an alternative production system to replace citrus with. And unfortunately, a lot of these lands are increasingly being converted to solar farms or being sold for urban development. So this is not right. Like, this is highly undesirable. And way better if the resilience of the system could have been recognized, like the diminishing resilience, before it got to this place. Now, I only have one slide left. I hope I'm not over time. And for the practitioners amongst you, you might be wondering, like, okay, this is great, the theory. Hopefully it's somewhat interesting, but like, what does this mean for me? Like, what can I actually do? And I can't give you specifics because context matters, right? If you're going to apply these concepts to a local context, a field, a plot, a farm, or whatever, context matters a lot. But what I can give you is I can give you mechanisms of resilience. So these are principles that apply across all complex adaptive systems. And I do want to note that agricultural collapse can be driven by soil changes, right? This has happened at large spatial scales. It's in deep US history, deep human history, brought down civilizations. So principles to guide practice. First is to maintain or rebuild natural processes in your land base as much as possible. You want to restore self-organization in the biophysical components of your system. This means if you have wet soils, you're planting appropriately for wet soils instead of trying to dry them out. You guys, I think, probably know a lot better than I do what kind of natural processes are important in your system. Heterogeneity and diversity. You want to maintain or increase this as much as possible across all scales in your system, from soil microbiome all the way up, and across all dimensions of your system. There's so much evidence for this. There's buckets of empirical evidence to show that this consistently has a positive effect in increasing the ability of the system to absorb and buffer disturbances. In a related way to focusing more on kind of the social piece of this, and I know that this is important to producers and they already do this, but engaging in continual learning and relationship building, the more connections you have, the more networks you're part of, the more people you talk to, then the more possible choices or paths forward you have when stuff goes sideways, right? When unexpected disturbances happen. It's simply about having paths and choices available to you. Recognize, whether you like it or not, there's nonlinear dynamics and thresholds in all the dimensions of your system: environmental, social, and economic. That there are multiple scales and cross-scale feedback. So whatever your focal scale is, understand that at larger and smaller spatial and temporal scales, there's stuff happening that's going to impact like what you're seeing and what you're trying to do. Recognize that there's a difference between specific and general resilience and trade-offs between the two. So trying to maintain the resilience of like one component of your system often comes at the expense of other components or at the expense of the system level resilience. And system level resilience is more focused on the capacity to deal with those pesky things in that first column I had: uncertainty, complexity, and surprises. And finally, if you are trying to be ecologically resilient, in that broader meaning of the word, it means that you're aiming for long-term persistence and performance under a wide variety of conditions, including less than ideal conditions, rather than trying to maximize production. So that That's all I've got. I am going to stop sharing and hopefully there's a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Round of applause if you could hear it. We do actually have some questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions if we want. So we do have one in the chat first. And just a reminder for questions will need to be typed in the Q&A, and then we'll repeat the questions there for her to answer. So the first one was, as an agricultural educator, how can I discuss resilience when some of my audience doesn't think it's an issue?
Oh God. um, that I'm not good at that. You can probably tell from this presentation, right? That I like sit purely in like the space of theory and translating these concepts, right? To people who aren't academics. I mean, probably part of the audience today, I lost completely. I think that's something that's really important. And I don't know if there's easy ways to do that, right? Because as soon as you start to kind of strip the complexity of the meaning from the words, you lose all the parts that are important, that make ecological resilience like different and useful, to provide a different way of thinking about how your system operates over time. I would say that that's probably like a significant task that needs to like somebody needs to do that, right? Like how do we make these words and these concepts more user friendly? And I have no answers for you.
Great. So the next one is from Christy, and she says, curious about interconnectivity or inspirability as one of the key assumptions of CAS.
Interconnectability and what was the next word?
Interconnectivity and inspirability.
I don't know what's meant by those. Are people allowed to like verbally restate their question?
She can put it in the chat. Um, so while doing that, we have another one. So it's, how do we work towards more resilience systems when some of the current issues are so short term?
Oh my goodness, right? I mean, like there's what you can do in your own land, right? And then there's all the stuff you can't do because you don't have control over it. Like, right? Everything that's happening at other spatial and temporal scales that you don't have control over. But, hopefully within, like, let's say a farm scale, there are a number of significant things you can do. And I would, aside from, I mean, like reducing external inputs in order to rebuild natural processes in your own soil as much as possible, accompanying that, I think, is what you can do in all the land that you own that's adjacent to your fields, that's yours to do with what you want. And that's where like the empirical evidence on having like richly diverse plantings, native or otherwise, in all those buffer strips can have profound impacts in multiple ways, with soil and water and pest management, etc., in fields.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there was a clarification on the question. So meaning the ways things are all interconnected so that you cannot separate or isolate. Wondering if that is a feature of CAS as well.
Yeah, like this idea that yes, that there's positive and negative feedbacks both within and across scales. So sometimes there's a bit of a misnomer with this idea that like everything's connected, because that's part of complex systems thinking, right? Everything's connected, but everything's not connected equally, right? So you can have often your strongest coupling is going to happen like within whatever scale, like what your focal scale is. And while there are going to be cross-scale impacts that are impacting your focal scale, it doesn't mean that it's like a one-to-one relationship in terms of how strongly coupled everything is. So usually, I would say producers more than anybody understand like the dominant drivers in their own system, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that kind of leads into this next question in a sense. So where is your discipline moving over the past 2 to 3 years, in the next 2 to 3 years?
By discipline, if you mean the application of these ideas to agricultural systems, I would say our our focus, like the network that I run and the work that we're doing in LTAR, is trying to move from farm scale to bigger. Like personally, I'm most scared by and most interested in large scale collapse, where it doesn't matter what you do on your lands because what's happening at larger spatial and temporal scales, like Florida citrus, it didn't matter at the end of the day what any given farmer did differently than any other producer. Their citrus groves got destroyed, right?
Mm.
By the right initially resilience reduced by the hurricanes, climate amplified hurricanes. I'm allowed to say that word. Most of you probably aren't anymore. Um, and the pest that has come through. So I think that we know the least about trying to understand how these processes play out at large spatial and temporal scales to stop the Dust Bowl or its equivalent from happening again.
What time frames are relevant for determining if your farming practices are resilient?
Well, you guys know that better than I do, right? Because soil processes take forever. And that, lag time, right, of how long it takes to see differences, right? So we know, like, if you stick with some of those, principles that I talked about, for a decade or more, then you start to consistently see um, what I would say, like being able to produce and perform under a wide variety of conditions, right? You're not going to be hitting, like maximum production levels every year, but you're going to be able to maintain a high-ish, right, satisfying level of production over time. But the, long lag times for stuff like that, and to the whoever asked about, time scales earlier, right? Like not everybody has the capacity to implement practices now that are not necessarily going to pay off for 10 or 15 years, right? It's a real problem. And not the
Yeah.
producer's problem, right? Like we're making it impossible with policy and a number of other things to do things right.
Do monocropping determine the resilience?
Well, yes, I mean, it's bad. Let's put it that way, right? It's not as good. You're not as resilient, period, because you're monocropping for a variety of reasons, the ability of pests to spread, et cetera. I mean, all kinds of reasons. So anytime you go up from monocropping to adding something else, a cover crop, whatever, like, I shouldn't be so categorical about it because again, context matters, and there are almost certainly places, I know there's places where cover crops don't make sense, et cetera. But from a resilience perspective, more diverse, more heterogeneous. But it's also a Goldilocks. Like you can, there's like a enough, and then there's a too much, and having a redundancy to accompany that heterogeneity is important.
Yeah, I love that balance. Where can we go to learn more about how to develop, implement resilience planning strategies, mostly at the applied farm scale?
There are a variety of workbooks. Um, Australia, because of its climate issues, has been like ahead of the curve, I think, in thinking about this stuff. There are, I mean, for the more academics of you, the EU has had some researchers that have done some really great um, participatory assessment projects working with producers on resilience, over long time frames. There are different frameworks out there, like Climate Hub, I think, has one, like Resist, Accept, Direct, that are resilience-ish. They don't quite capture the full scope. Environmental Defense Fund did a project in Kansas, actually, trying to understand the future of agriculture in Kansas, given the declining aquifers, the Ogallala, especially where they are, is being stripped quite quickly, and then coupled with climate change. So they have if you Google Environmental Defense Fund and it's like Kansas 50/50 or something, they did a really great project that talks specifics about what producers can do to try to increase their resilience and implement some of these practices. There's lots and lots and lots of academic literature and maybe not as much for practitioners or producers. So it's a shortfall.
Yeah. So we have a few more questions for you, but I'm gonna ask if you would answer those maybe on the side as we
Of course.
continue. So I think you should have access, but feel free to keep asking questions in the Q&A. And then Shana will be able to go through and answer these questions by typing an answer. And then again, thank you all for using the Q&A instead of the chat. It helps us keep track of everything. So thank you, and we'll move on to our next speaker.
Thanks, you guys.